January 1995. The city of Grozny, located at the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains in southern Russia. Once one of the most beautiful and prosperous cities of the Soviet Union, it had now turned into a living hell. The skies above the city trembled with the deafening roar of Russian warplanes and the relentless bombardment. The streets were littered with the burning wreckage of Russian tanks and armored vehicles. Every building, every apartment block had become a concrete skeleton, its empty windows staring back like hollow eyes reflecting death and destruction. This was the most horrifying chapter of the First Chechen War, the Battle of Grozny. Russia's massive army, once regarded as one of the world's greatest military powers, found itself trapped in the capital of one of its own tiny republics. Opposing them was a small but extraordinarily courageous and ruthless force of Chechen separatists. These fighters had turned every street, every alley, and every ruined building into a fortress, transforming Grozny into a deadly trap for Russian soldiers. The war was a modern version of David versus Goliath. On one side stood nuclear-armed Russia, on the other a small, freedom-loving nation in the Caucasus Mountains. Yet the outcome shocked the world. Russia suffered a humiliating defeat, exposing the weakness of the Russian state in the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse. But why? Why did this small territory in the Caucasus become such a bloody and endless nightmare for Russia? What gave the Chechens the strength to continue their struggle for independence against some of the world's most powerful empires for centuries? And how did this nationalist movement gradually transform into an uncompromising jihadist movement over time? These are the complex and bloody questions that today's episode of Adyapanto seeks to answer. Chechnya is a mountainous region in the North Caucasus. Its rugged high mountains, deep valleys, and dense forests have shaped the character of its inhabitants for centuries. The Chechens call themselves Nokchi, and their social system is very different from that of the outside world. The foundation of their society is the Taip, or clan system. Every Chechen belongs to a specific clan, and loyalty to that clan is often considered more important than loyalty to the state or any other institution. This clan structure has created a deep sense of unity and brotherhood among the Chechens, giving them remarkable resilience against outside enemies. Throughout history, the Chechens have been known as a fiercely independent and warrior-like people. In their culture, courage, honor, and freedom are valued above life itself. Surviving in the harsh mountainous environment required constant struggle, which fostered a spirit that refused compromise. Their conflict with Russia began in the 18th century, when Tsar Peter the Great and later Catherine the Great decided to expand the Russian Empire southward into the Caucasus. Russia's goal was to control the routes leading toward Persia and the Ottoman Empire. However, the mountain peoples of the Caucasus, particularly the Chechens and the Dagestanis, stood as an almost impenetrable barrier to these imperial ambitions. This led to nearly half a century of brutal and bloody conflict, known in history as the Caucasian War, which lasted from 1817 to 1864. During this war, the Muslim tribes of the Caucasus mounted a heroic but uneven resistance against the Russian Empire under the leadership of Imam Shamil. Imam Shamil was a charismatic and highly skilled military leader who managed to hold back the Tsar's vast armies for nearly 25 years. The Chechens formed the backbone of his resistance. They employed highly effective guerrilla tactics that turned the Caucasus into a death trap for Russian forces. Eventually, Imam Shamil was forced to surrender in 1859, and by 1864, Russia had completely conquered the Caucasus region. However, this victory came at a terrible cost. Russia succeeded in occupying the territory, but it never managed to suppress the Chechens' desire for freedom. The war created a deep and lasting hatred and mistrust of the Russians among the Chechens, feelings that would continue to pass from one generation to the next. The Caucasian War was the first spark that would eventually grow into a devastating fire in the 20th century. The Russian Revolution of 1917 and the establishment of the Soviet Union brought new hope to the Chechens. They had believed that after the end of the Tsarist imperial rule, they might finally regain the independence they had long awaited. However, that dream quickly turned into a nightmare. The Bolsheviks, who had initially spoken of the right of all nations to self-determination, established a centralized and authoritarian rule, much like the Tsars once they came to power. During the 1920s and 1930s, Chechnya, like many other regions of the Soviet Union, became a victim of Stalin's harsh policies. Forced collectivization was imposed upon the Chechens, a system completely incompatible with their traditional way of life. Islam was also severely suppressed, and many mosques were closed. The Chechens rebelled several times against these policies, but each uprising was brutally crushed by the Soviet Red Army. However, the darkest and most painful chapter in Chechen history came during the Second World War. On February 23, 1944, Joseph Stalin issued a terrifying order. He accused the entire Chechen and neighboring Ingush populations of collaborating with Nazi Germany, a charge widely regarded as false, and ordered their complete deportation from their homeland. The operation was codenamed Operation Lentil. Members of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, surrounded Chechen villages and forced all Chechens, including women, children, and the elderly, out of their homes at gunpoint. They were given only 20 minutes to gather their belongings. They were then herded into freight train wagons like cattle and transported thousands of miles away to the barren steppes of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and Siberia. The journey itself was an unimaginable nightmare. The overcrowded train cars had almost no food or water. Thousands died along the way from cold, hunger, and disease. Those who survived the journey faced an equally grim future. In the harsh and unfamiliar environment, they had neither shelter nor means of livelihood. Approximately 500,000 Chechens and Ingush were deported during this exile. Historians estimate that between 1/4 and 1/3 of them died within the first few years of deportation. It was an unspeakable tragedy of mass death and ethnic persecution. After Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev allowed the Chechens to return to their homeland in 1957. But when they came back, they discovered that Russians and other ethnic groups had settled in their homes and occupied their lands. This led to renewed tensions and conflicts between the communities. The deportation of 1944, known among the Chechens as Ardak, the exile, remains a deep and irreparable wound in their collective memory. It permanently reinforced their hatred and distrust of Moscow. This trauma and sense of injustice would later become one of the driving forces behind the Chechen independence movement of the 1990s. In August 1991, the failed hardline coup against Mikhail Gorbachev delivered the final blow to the Soviet Union. Taking advantage of the central government's weakness, many Soviet republics began declaring their independence one after another. This wave eventually reached Chechnya as well. At this time, a new political figure emerged in Chechnya: Johar Dudayev, a former Soviet Air Force general. Dudayev was a charismatic and determined nationalist leader who revived the Chechen aspiration for independence. In October 1991, Dudayev was elected president of Chechnya, and shortly afterward, he unilaterally declared the independence of Chechnya as the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the new Russian Federation was being established under the leadership of Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin had accepted the collapse of the Soviet Union, but he was unwilling to compromise on the territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. Chechnya was considered one of Russia's autonomous republics, rather than a union republic of the Soviet Union. Therefore, Yeltsin's government never recognized Chechnya's declaration of independence. Moscow feared that if Chechnya were allowed to secede, other ethnic republics within Russia, such as Tatarstan and Dagestan, might also demand independence, potentially causing the entire federation to collapse in a domino effect. In addition, Chechnya held immense strategic importance. The main pipeline transporting oil and gas from the Caspian region through the Caucasus to the Black Sea passed directly through Chechnya, making the region economically and geopolitically vital for Russia. Russia was completely unwilling to lose this economic lifeline. Over the next 3 years, Moscow carried out various covert operations to destabilize Dudayev's government. It supported opposition groups within Chechnya with weapons and financial aid, attempting to provoke a civil war. However, these efforts repeatedly failed because of the widespread support that Dudayev enjoyed among the Chechen people. Finally, in December 1994, Boris Yeltsin decided to launch a direct military intervention in Chechnya. Russia's defense minister at the time, Pavel Grachev, confidently claimed that Grozny could be captured within a few hours by a single airborne regiment. This proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. On December 11, 1994, Russian forces entered Chechnya from 3 directions. They believed the operation would be a short and simple campaign to restore constitutional order. Instead, they found themselves in a full-scale and brutal war. The Chechen fighters, who knew every inch of their homeland and were prepared to die for their independence, launched constant guerrilla attacks against the Russian troops. The most devastating chapter of the war came during the Russian assault on Grozny during the New Year period of 1994 to 1995. Inexperienced and psychologically unprepared Russian soldiers were sent into the center of the city in columns of armored vehicles, a tactic that proved almost suicidal. Many Chechen fighters had previous experience serving in the Soviet military. From the basements and rooftops of apartment buildings, they used RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, to destroy Russian tanks and armored vehicles one after another. The streets of Grozny became a burning graveyard for Russian soldiers. After several weeks of fierce fighting, Russian forces eventually captured Grozny. They reduced much of the city to rubble. However, although they succeeded in occupying the city, they failed to break the Chechen resistance. The war spread into the villages and mountainous regions of Chechnya. During the conflict, the Russian military was accused of committing widespread human rights violations. Numerous allegations emerged of indiscriminate bombing of civilians, extrajudicial killings, and the torture of prisoners in so-called filtration camps. On the other hand, Chechen fighters under commanders such as Shamil Basayev also resorted to brutal tactics. In 1995, Basayev led the hostage-taking at a hospital in the Russian town of Budyonovsk, where hundreds of people were held captive. This incident expanded the war beyond Chechnya's borders. After 21 months of bloody conflict, Chechen fighters launched a daring counteroffensive in August 1996 and recaptured Grozny. The exhausted and demoralized Russian army was forced to withdraw. The conflict ended with the signing of the Khasavyurt Accord, mediated by the influential Russian politician Alexander Lebed. Under the agreement, Russian troops withdrew from Chechnya, and the question of Chechnya's final political status was postponed for 5 years. For Russia, it was a humiliating defeat. One of the world's largest armies had been defeated by a small republic, exposing Russia's weakness before the international community. For the Chechens, it was a tremendous victory. They had effectively achieved de facto independence. However, this independence came at a terrible cost: the deaths of approximately 80,000 to 100,000 people and the destruction of an entire country. Although victory in the First Chechen War brought Chechnya de facto independence, it did not bring peace or stability. The 3-year period between 1996 and 1999 became a time of chaos, lawlessness, and ideological transformation. The nationalist ideals that had initially inspired the independence movement gradually began to give way to a more radical religious ideology. Chechnya's economy had been completely devastated by the war. There were no industries, no jobs, and the capital, Grozny, lay in ruins. Under these circumstances, power increasingly fell into the hands of various warlords and military commanders who had gained prominence during the war. The elected president, Aslan Maskhadov, had little effective control over the country. Each warlord governed his own territory with his own militia. With the economy in collapse, crime became one of Chechnya's main industries. Kidnapping for ransom, oil theft, and black market sales, and arms smuggling became commonplace. Businessmen and journalists from various parts of Russia were often kidnapped and brought into Chechnya. This growing anarchy and insecurity eventually caused the international community to turn away from Chechnya. No country officially recognized the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. Amid this political and economic vacuum, a new force began to rise in Chechnya: Wahhabi or Salafi jihadism. During the war, many foreign mujahideen came to fight in Chechnya, including veterans of the Soviet-Afghan War. Their leader was a Saudi-born jihadist known as Khattab. They brought with them substantial financial resources, as well as a rigid and uncompromising religious ideology. These foreign jihadists and their local supporters, including influential commanders such as Shamil Basayev, began promoting the idea of a global jihad instead of Chechnya's traditional Sufi Islam. Their objective was not merely Chechen independence, but the establishment of an Islamic emirate across the entire North Caucasus. They denounced the secular nationalist government of the elected president, Aslan Maskhadov, as infidel and began demanding the implementation of Sharia law. This ideological conflict gradually divided Chechen society from within. On one side stood traditional nationalists such as Maskhadov, who envisioned an independent but secular Chechen state. On the other side were Islamists such as Basayev and Khattab, who sought to transform Chechnya into a new front in the global jihad movement. The ultimate expression of this internal conflict came in August 1999. Under the leadership of Shamil Basayev and Khattab, a force of approximately 1,500 Chechen and foreign fighters invaded the neighboring Russian Republic of Dagestan. Their objective was to spark an uprising there and take the first step toward establishing an Islamic state throughout the Caucasus. The invasion of Dagestan served as a final warning for Russia. At the same time, a new and hardline leader was emerging in Moscow: Vladimir Putin. The chaos in Chechnya and the rise of jihadist groups provided Putin with an opportunity to restore complete Russian control over the region. The brief and bloody dream of Chechen independence was approaching its end. Basayev's attack in Dagestan exhausted Russia's patience. Soon afterward, in September 1999, a series of devastating apartment bombings occurred in several Russian cities, including Moscow, Volgodonsk, and Buynaksk. Nearly 300 civilians were killed. The Russian government blamed Chechen jihadists for the attacks, despite the absence of conclusive evidence. Many critics, including some within Russia itself, have argued that the bombings may have been a false flag operation conducted by the Russian Security Service, the FSB, with the purpose of creating a justification for a renewed war in Chechnya. Whatever the truth may be, the bombings generated widespread fear and anger among the Russian public. Vladimir Putin, then Prime Minister and soon to become President, used this public sentiment to his advantage. He emerged as a tough and uncompromising leader, promising to hunt down and eliminate the terrorists. In October 1999, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Chechnya under the banner of a counter-terrorism operation. This conflict became known as the Second Chechen War. Having learned from the mistakes of the First War, the Russian military was far more organized, coordinated, and ruthless this time. Before launching ground offensives, Russian forces spent weeks conducting massive airstrikes and artillery bombardments against Chechen towns and villages, reducing many of them to ruins. By February 2000, after a prolonged and bloody siege, Russian forces regained control of Grozny. President Aslan Maskhadov and other separatist leaders retreated to the mountains, where they continued a guerrilla insurgency. This time, however, Putin appointed Kadyrov as the head of the pro-Russian administration in Chechnya. In return, Kadyrov and his loyal militia, later known as the Kadyrovtsi, received almost complete authority over internal security within Chechnya. Their mission was to locate and eliminate the separatist guerrillas. Through Putin's strategy, the conflict eventually evolved into a Chechen civil war, in which one group of Chechens, supported by Moscow, began fighting and killing another group of Chechens. This strategy proved highly effective. The Kadyrov forces, who possessed extensive knowledge of the local terrain and clan structures, were far more successful than the Russian military in suppressing the insurgency. In 2004, Akhmad Kadyrov was killed in a bombing attack. Putin subsequently elevated his son, Ramzan Kadyrov, to succeed him. Ramzan Kadyrov proved to be even more charismatic and ambitious than his father. With vast financial assistance and political support from Moscow, he established a harsh and authoritarian regime in Chechnya. His personal security forces began abducting, torturing, and killing separatists, human rights activists, journalists, and anyone who criticized his rule. By 2009, the main separatist resistance in Chechnya had been almost completely destroyed, and Russia officially declared its counterterrorism operation in Chechnya over. The war had ended, but for Chechnya, a new and even more complex chapter had begun. Today, if you visit Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, you may find it difficult to believe your eyes. The city that was reduced to ruins just 2 decades ago has been transformed into a modern metropolis filled with glass skyscrapers, broad avenues, luxury shopping centers, and one of Europe's largest mosques. Everything seems to symbolize a new and prosperous Chechnya. This is the peace established by Ramzan Kadyrov. Using billions of dollars from Russia's federal budget, Kadyrov has rebuilt Chechnya. On the surface, the republic appears stable. There are no gun battles in the streets and no regular bombings. Yet behind this apparent peace lies a much darker reality. Under Ramzan Kadyrov, Chechnya has effectively become a personal fiefdom within the Russian Federation, where Russian law often takes a back seat to Kadyrov's authority. He has established a highly personalized authoritarian system based on strict control and unquestioning loyalty. According to reports by international human rights organizations, Kadyrov's security forces, known as the Kadyrovtsi, have been involved in extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, and torture. Even the slightest criticism of the regime is often met with severe consequences. Human rights activists, independent journalists, and even ordinary citizens who post critical comments on social media have reportedly faced intimidation, detention, or disappearance. Kadyrov has also promoted a state-sponsored version of Islam in Chechnya, emphasizing a conservative and traditional Sufi identity while strongly opposing Wahhabism. The wearing of headscarves by women has been encouraged or required in many public settings, and several social practices inspired by Sharia law have been implemented, sometimes creating tensions with Russia's secular constitution. For Vladimir Putin, however, this arrangement has proven highly beneficial. In exchange for financial support and broad autonomy, Putin has secured 2 important objectives. First, separatism in Chechnya has been firmly suppressed. Second, Kadyrov has demonstrated absolute loyalty to Putin. Kadyrov often describes himself as Putin's foot soldier and has shown his loyalty by sending Chechen forces to support Russian military operations, including the war in Ukraine. Therefore, the peace that exists in Chechnya today is not a democratic peace. It is a fragile stability built upon fear, repression, and centralized authority. The desire for independence, deeply rooted in Chechen history and identity, may currently remain dormant, but it has not been entirely extinguished. Beneath Kadyrov's iron rule, this volatile region of the Caucasus may still be quietly waiting for another future upheaval. The history of Chechnya is the story of an endless tragedy. It is the story of a people willing to pay any price for their freedom, and of an empire willing to employ any level of force to preserve its territorial integrity. For the Chechens, their identity, honor, and very existence are closely tied to the idea of an independent homeland. For many, remaining under Russian rule means accepting centuries of oppression, humiliation, and memories of persecution. For Russia, however, Chechnya represents an important symbol of national sovereignty and a key to maintaining strategic control over the Caucasus. From Moscow's perspective, allowing Chechnya to break away would signal weakness and encourage separatist movements elsewhere in the Federation, potentially threatening the unity of the Russian state itself. The clash between these two opposing aspirations turned Chechnya into a bloody battlefield. The collapse of the Soviet Union offered the Chechens a brief opportunity for independence, but internal disorder and the rise of jihadist movements transformed that dream into a nightmare. The rise of Vladimir Putin and the policy of Chechenization succeeded in ending the war, but they buried the aspiration for Chechen independence beneath a harsh authoritarian system. Today's Chechnya may be peaceful, but it is not truly free. This small and turbulent land in the Caucasus reminds us that military force and economic resources may suppress a nation's desire for independence for a time, but completely eradicating that desire is often nearly impossible.